Today, we have 3 stories about people who are absolutely sure they have found the solution to all their problems. But they're wrong, and other people have to face the consequences. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the follow button a nice, fresh ice cream cone. But don't tell them you've secretly hidden a thumbtack in the middle of it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into very late at night on May 19th, 2014, a young man named Yusuf frantically dug a shovel into the dirt behind his home in the city of Fez, Morocco. He was on the verge of absolute panic, so he kept trying to take deep breaths while he worked to calm himself down. But to be honest, this was basically impossible, because lying next to the hole that he was currently trying to dig was a woman's dead body. So just a few hours ago, Yusuf had actually been on a date with this woman. Her name was Mina El Houari, and she lived more than 1,000 miles away in France. But she and Yusuf had met online, and they had been talking long distance for a few months, and that morning, Mina had flown down to Morocco so they could finally meet in person. And Yusuf had been incredibly nervous about this meeting. But when Mina had arrived at his house a few hours earlier that night to go on this date, everything had actually gone exactly right. He had made her dinner, and their conversation had been super easy and very lively, and they were like laughing a lot of the time. It was like their chemistry online had perfectly translated to real life. It was great. That was until all of a sudden, in the middle of their meal and in the middle of laughing and having this wonderful time, Mina had gotten this weird spaced out look on her face, and then she abruptly collapsed on the floor. Yusuf had immediately rushed over to her to see if she was okay, but he quickly realized she hadn't just collapsed. She was dead. And Yusuf, he had no idea why or how this was even possible. I mean, nothing had happened. They had just been talking and laughing and eating, and then she just dropped. And it was so shocking that Yusuf hadn't been able to think straight. I mean, even now, as he was digging this hole, his mind was a mess, and it was hard to focus on anything. But he did have one sort of single, clear thought that he just kept going back to that was driving his current behavior, which was everybody was going to think he killed her. I mean, the whole situation was undeniably weird and hard to believe. He knew the police would never buy that Mina had just randomly dropped dead immediately after flying to Morocco to meet him for the first time. Like, it immediately cast suspicion on Yusuf. I mean, he knew that what everyone was going to assume, police included, was that he had lured Mina there and then killed her. And there was no one else who saw what actually happened, who could, back up what he actually saw. And so it was just kind of his word against what people saw. And so he knew he looked incredibly guilty. And so to Yusuf, he felt like even in the best case scenario, he was going to very likely spend a long time in jail before his name was ever cleared of this. And worst case, he'd be convicted of a murder he didn't commit, and then he would just stay in jail. And so Yusuf had decided the only thing he could do, based on sort of his knowledge, at least as he saw it, of what had happened, the only way he could protect himself was to try to cover everything up. Yusuf dug as fast as he could, constantly looking over his shoulders, making sure his neighbors weren't watching or that nobody was outside. And then finally, after what felt like forever, when he felt like the hole was deep enough, he put the shovel down, and then he took Mina's lifeless body, he rolled her into the hole, and then he covered her right back up and just hoped that this was going to be enough to keep him from getting in trouble. Now, Yusuf, after this was done, had sort of half expected to feel relieved that he had, taken care of this problem. But over the next few days, he was so anxious about getting caught that he felt sick to his stomach most of the time. I mean, he couldn't function at work, and he canceled plans with his friends, and he could barely sleep. And then one morning, his worst nightmare came true. He heard a knock on his front door, and he opened it up to see 2 police officers standing on his doorstep. Yusuf's heart pounded in his chest, but he somehow managed to stay relatively calm, and he smiled, and he invited the officers inside. They all sat down in the living room, and Yusuf, who's like super anxious, he's so worried, he's doing his best to appear normal. And as he's doing that, the officers explained to him that they were here to investigate the disappearance of Mina El-Houari. And Yusuf, pretty much the instant they said her name, he said, "Oh, yeah, I'm sorry to hear about that, but I don't know of anybody by that name." But as the words were leaving his mouth, he could hear the anxiety coming off his own voice, and he could tell the officers instantaneously did not believe him. In fact, one of the officers just right away leaned forward and said that according to Mina's family, the last time they spoke to her, she was leaving her hotel to go meet you. Yusuf froze for a moment, and then he opened his mouth to try and respond, but his mind just went completely blank. He couldn't believe how stupid he was to have not even considered the fact that Mina's family might know where she was going. He knew that trying to cover this up had just made him look way more suspicious, and now he couldn't think of any way to get out of this, except by telling the truth. And so Yusuf just began sobbing, and he blurted out the whole story. Mina had been at his house that night, and she'd just suddenly died, and he'd panicked and he'd buried her in his backyard, but he insisted that he didn't kill her, and he begged them to just do an autopsy because it would prove that he was not responsible. She was dead. He just buried her. The officers were shocked by what they were hearing. I mean, this immediate confession that the person they're looking for is dead. I mean, this was shocking. One of the officers immediately jumped up with a cell phone and called for a forensics team. And the other officer, who had just heard this confession, just looked at Yusuf and shook his head. And Yusuf, who was feeling horrible at this point, he just put his face in his hands and he cried, and he thought to himself what a horrible mistake he had made, covering this up. And he knew now for sure he was going to be in an incredible amount of trouble. But there was a small silver lining, and that was, despite definitely getting in trouble, they would see when they did the autopsy that he didn't do this. He had mishandled her death, no doubt, but he didn't kill her. So once that came out, it would show what really happened here. That same day, Mina's body was exhumed from Yusuf's backyard where he said it would be, and her body was taken to the coroner. And when the autopsy results came back, the police were actually kind of surprised because Yusuf was telling the truth. However, there was one thing Yusuf didn't know. Just like Yusuf had told the police, he was not responsible for Mina's random collapse on his floor during their date. Mina actually had undiagnosed diabetes, and she had collapsed due to critically high blood sugar, so that part was true. But Yusuf's steadfast belief that he did not kill her was not correct. It would turn out that in his state of panic after Mina collapsed, Yusuf, who was very impulsive, had not been careful in confirming that Mina was actually dead, because it would turn out she wasn't. Mina, because of her diabetes, was in a diabetic coma. So when Yusuf buried her, she was still alive. He'd been so desperate to avoid getting in trouble for murder that he'd committed a murder. When the autopsy results came back, they showed Mina had died from suffocation after being buried in the ground, a truly horrific way to die. As for Yusuf, he was charged with involuntary manslaughter. Early in the afternoon of November 28, 1993, a young fisherman named Daniel haggled with a vendor at a bustling outdoor fish market in Manacara, which is a port city in Madagascar. This market was so loud, it was chaotic, and it was packed with hundreds and hundreds of locals. There were vendors who stood at their stands selling piles of fish out of plastic buckets on the ground or laid out on banana leaves and wooden pallets. And it was already getting very hot, and the air was buzzing with flies while stray dogs wandered through the lines of customers. But Daniel was not buying from these vendors. He was selling. Because earlier that morning, he and his fishing crew had pulled in their nets and found a 6-foot-long bull shark tangled up in their netting. And for Daniel, this was literally the catch of a lifetime. This shark had so much meat on it, he was sure it would sell for more than his crew normally made in a whole month. I mean, this was huge. And so Daniel and this vendor, they haggle for a bit longer, and then they finally settle on a price. And Daniel, can't believe the vendor's gonna pay that much money. I mean, this was an astounding amount of money. And then as the vendor pulled out a big wad of bills and began peeling off how much he was gonna pay Daniel, I mean, Daniel couldn't believe it. This was not just the most money he had ever made at one time in his life. I mean, this was easily the most. But more than that, this was literally the most cash he had ever seen in person all at once. This was life-changing money. And as soon as those bills were handed over to Daniel, for a moment he just looked at the money how can this be real? But then he folded them up, he stuffed it in his pocket, and then he handed off all the shark meat, and then he turned and he walked out of the market. Later that night, Daniel sat at the dinner table with his family while his uncle raised a cup to toast Daniel's big catch. The family had actually already spent a little bit of the money that Daniel had earned from the shark on this celebratory meal. The table was full of food and alcohol. I mean, this was a feast. And Daniel, he was feeling really proud. He was actually the youngest fisherman in his family. So the fact that he had been the one who made this catch was a really big deal. And so once his uncle finished this elaborate toast about how great Daniel was, Daniel just smiled and then downed his own cup in a single gulp. And the alcohol really burned his throat, but he managed to get it down without wincing, and then he told everyone to dig in. About 6 hours later, Daniel woke up covered in sweat. His tongue was tingling like he had just eaten something really spicy, and there was also this strange metallic taste in his mouth. He tried to sit up and he realized that actually his legs were tingly too. The burning sensation in his mouth kept getting worse and worse until Daniel was desperate for something to drink. He tried to stand, but he fell right out of bed, knocking over his lamp. And the crash brought Daniel's aunt and uncle running into the room, and Daniel, he told them to please get him some water. So his aunt, in a panic, she turned and she ran out and came back a few seconds later with a cup of water. Daniel, he grabbed the cup and starts chugging as fast as he can, but the water burned horribly and he spat it out and he screamed in pain. And then he turned to his aunt and he yelled at her, asking her why had she brought him scalding hot tea. But she just looked at him confused and said she hadn't. It was just regular room temperature water. A few hours later, and Daniel's symptoms were only getting worse. So his aunt, she went outside and she flagged down a man that was pulling a rickshaw, and she asked him to please take Daniel to the hospital. And the guy said he would. And by the time they got to the hospital, Daniel, in addition to his other symptoms, now also had a pounding headache, and he was beginning to fade in and out of consciousness. And so because of that, Daniel's aunt and uncle, who had come with him, had to physically help lift him off the rickshaw and sort of carry him into the hospital. And then as soon as they were in the hospital, Daniel heard his aunt gasp. And so Daniel, he lifted his head up to see what she was reacting to. And for a second, in his delirium, he thought maybe he was back at the fish market, because there were people everywhere packed together in a dense mob filling up every inch of the room. But then he realized this was not the fish market, this was the hospital, and these were all the other people trying to check in to the emergency room. But then Daniel's vision began to go, and he was sort of in and out of consciousness again, and before he knew it, he was being laid out on a stretcher and carried over to this hallway, which was somehow even more crowded and more chaotic than the waiting room. And all around him, despite not really having a good sense of what was going on, he could still tell that there were nurses and doctors running back and forth treating patients right there in the hall. And the patients all seemed to have gone crazy. Daniel could see there was one man who was writhing around in obvious physical pain while a nurse just sort of dabbed his forehead with a wet washcloth. And this man was shouting that the towel was too hot, while the nurse kept saying that it was not, it was cold. Other patients were complaining that it was freezing in the hall, even though they were visibly sweating profusely. And a woman that Daniel couldn't quite see kept screaming about a hot stethoscope, which didn't even make any sense. It was totally surreal. It was like the entire city had descended on this hospital and everybody had gone mad. But then through all this madness, Daniel heard one of the medical staff shouting that they needed more respirators because they had just lost another patient. By the end of that day, this hospital was completely overrun with people all over the city who all had the same symptoms, including numb or tingling limbs, headaches, confusion, and feeling that anything cold was hot and anything hot was cold. Now, the doctors and the medical staff had no idea what was causing this outbreak. But very quickly, these patients began falling into comas and then dying by the dozens. Ultimately, the local medical staff, the local doctors, had to call in a team of outside investigators, experts, to come in and figure out what was going on here. And those investigators tracked the outbreak backwards to where it all started, and their search led them to the Manakara fish market and to Daniel. It would turn out Daniel had been right. That huge shark that he caught really was the catch of a lifetime. But it would turn out these same qualities that made the shark so valuable also made it deadly. The shark was valuable primarily because it was huge, with enough meat to feed a whole community. But sharks basically keep growing until they die, so the reason that this bull shark was so big was because it was so old. And during the many years it had been alive, it had consumed an enormous amount of something called ciguatoxin. Ciguatoxin is a chemical compound produced by a very specific kind of algae. Fish eat this algae, and then sharks eat the fish, and the toxin builds up in the sharks' bodies over time. Now, this is not really a problem for the fish or even the sharks, but for the humans who eat those sharks who have this toxin in them, it causes ciguatera poisoning, which has very bizarre neurological symptoms, like feeling that anything cold is actually excruciatingly hot, and vice versa. Now, in most cases, this is not fatal. But Daniel's very old shark had spent literal decades accumulating ciguatoxin until its meat was off the charts toxic. And because the shark was so big, there was so much toxic meat, and that vendor who bought it from Daniel, he sold that meat to hundreds and hundreds of people at the fish market. And Daniel and his family, they didn't buy any of this meat. They just kept a portion for their dinner that night. That was part of their celebratory meal. All told, around 500 people got sick from this shark. 188 of them wound up in the hospital, and 98 of them died, which means Daniel's shark actually killed more people than every single great white shark attack in recorded history combined. All by itself, this one bull shark made its species the deadliest shark in the world. One morning in early May of 1896, a young man named Nicholas Romanov sat in his palace in Moscow, Russia, listening anxiously as one of his advisors delivered their daily report. Nicholas was actually just weeks away from being officially crowned as the next ruler of Russia, the Tsar. And this report he was getting was about the many decisions that Nicholas now had to make. Nicholas's family, the Romanovs, had been ruling over Russia for the last 300 years, and Nicholas's father had just died. So now it was Nicholas's turn to step up and lead the country. And this was pretty much the worst thing that had ever happened to Nicholas. Partly, this was because he loved and admired his father, and he was devastated that he was gone. But mostly, it was because Nicholas didn't know anything about leading a country. He was a quiet person and would rather spend his time reading or taking walks with his wife. And his father really hadn't prepared him at all for this moment. He'd never taught Nicholas about the country he would one day be running. Also, growing up, Nicholas had rarely ever left their palace. So literally, he hadn't actually seen the vast majority of Russia. He basically lived in a bubble. And so Nicholas just felt completely unprepared and unsure of himself. And then Nicholas's advisor began asking him all these questions about what Nicholas wanted to do for his coronation ceremony and the festivities around it. which would be taking place in a few weeks. And as he sat there listening, it's like Nicholas felt so overwhelmed, he felt sick to his stomach. But then Nicholas had this brilliant idea about his upcoming coronation. I mean, he had lots of problems to deal with, but it was like he had thought of this perfect solution for what to do about the coronation. And it was so obvious, he couldn't believe he hadn't thought of it earlier. Nicholas didn't actually have to make any of these decisions he was being asked to make himself. He could just copy his father, who had successfully ruled over Russia for 13 years and obviously knew what he was doing. He could just copy all of his decisions about what he did when he was coronated. So Nicholas interrupted his advisor and said he didn't want to answer any more questions about this coronation. Instead, the organizers should simply just recreate his father's ceremony and celebration. Use the same location, the same food, the same everything. At this, Nicholas's advisor sort of looked at him with a strange look in his face and asked if Nicholas was really sure about that. And Nicholas just nodded and said, yes, of course. So the advisor nodded and hurried off. And Nicholas exhaled with relief. After that, Nicholas just spent the next few weeks in a much more relaxed state. He obviously was going to have lots more problems and issues that he would have to deal with as a czar. But really the coronation had become like the big stressful thing for him because it was so soon, and now he had solved for it. And so he had just gone back to reading and taking walks and just sort of taking it easy. The last few weeks he was going to be able to do that before he was officially czar, and just allowed his organizers to recreate, his father's coronation for him. And they did just that. Per Nicholas's instructions, the organizers really set up the exact same event they had held 13 years earlier for his father. They invited the general public, and they used the same venue for the festivities called the Kadinka Field, which is just outside of Moscow. And they made sure there'd be the exact same food stalls set up to hand out the same sausages and bread rolls and little souvenir cups to the public. And the same musicians were there to perform and entertain the visitors until Nicholas made his imperial entrance. It was all exactly the same. And then finally, after all the preparations had been made, the day finally arrived. Early in the morning on May 30th, so Coronation Day, a reporter named Vladimir Gilyarovsky tried to push his way through the huge crowd at Kadinka Field, this massive area that spanned over a mile wide with a pavilion and stage in the middle of it. Vladimir was there to cover the new Tsar's coronation. And he was, so far, really impressed by the turnout. I mean, the actual celebration hadn't even started yet, and already there were hundreds of thousands of people packed into every inch of this enormous field. Now, Vladimir remembered the celebration for Nicholas's father's coronation, but there had not been nearly as many people at that one. And so Vladimir, at some point, he began trying to make his way over to the food area. But he could barely move. The crowd was so dense that each step he took was basically just a small inch forward. It was like you couldn't go anywhere. And as Vladimir is trying to navigate this mob, he heard someone yell something to the crowd. And all the people around Vladimir started repeating what had just been yelled to them, like they were passing it along across the entire crowd over and over again until it was like everybody was yelling it. And as this happened, Vladimir felt like the energy shift around him. The crowd, who had been sort of restless before, now it was like they were all moving with a purpose, all moving at once. Like everybody was trying to move in the same direction. And as this happened, as Vladimir was doing his best to kind of go with the flow here, he began hearing people scream. But before Vladimir, or anybody else for that matter, could even react, everything just became a blur of more screams and just mass panic with limbs and bodies all shoving against him and falling at his feet. And then at some point, Vladimir was so compressed by all these people that he couldn't move, he couldn't breathe, he couldn't scream. He was just stuck. So Nicholas Romanov had decided he would copy his father's coronation celebration exactly as it happened. He was just going to mimic that exact same thing. And it would turn out that choice seemed like a good one, but in practice was a very bad choice. Because Nicholas, despite being Russian and living in Russia and about to be in charge of Russia, did not know the first thing about his country. He didn't know about the country's economics or politics or social issues. He lived in his bubble in the palace. And so because of that, he didn't realize that the Russia that he was inheriting was not the same one as the one his dad had inherited. And it would turn out this Russia was starving. At Nicholas's father's coronation celebration, they had handed out bread rolls and sausages to the people who came. And so Nicholas told his advisors to advertise the same thing for his own celebration. But in a literally starving country, this meant when those advertisements went out that there would be free food at this coronation, this meant a gigantic horde of 500,000 starving people showed up, not to see their new czar, but to eat. And the number of people who showed up looking for food was way more than the organizers had planned for. And once all those people had descended on the field and were eating that food, at some point, one of those people saw the food was dwindling and they yelled out to the crowd that the food was almost gone. That was the phrase that the reporter, Vladimir, heard people yelling and then repeating, which caused the panic. People began to rush towards the vendors to get the food before it ran out, and it caused a massive stampede. And so for hours, the crowd shoved and pushed and fought and ran over the bodies of people who had fallen. Ultimately, around 1,300 people were suffocated or trampled to death right in that field. And that reporter, Vladimir, who had been on the ground and saw it firsthand, he survived. And he wrote a detailed article about how horrible it was. And the media generally blamed Nicholas for the whole thing. So Nicholas's reputation, which he'd tried to bolster by copying his successful father, was completely destroyed before it even began. And in fact, for the rest of his reign, the people called him Nicholas the Bloody. The country only continued to face economic problems under Nicholas's reign. And in fact, 22 years after he became czar, after this tragedy at the coronation, a group of revolutionaries murdered Nicholas the Bloody and his family and ended monarchy forever in Russia. This episode is called Bad Blood. It was February 24th, 1991, and Jennifer Jackson was at a hospital in St. Louis, Missouri. She was in labor, and she was about to give birth to her second child. And she was doing it alone. Her boyfriend and the father of this child, Brian Stewart, was an Army medic, and currently he was deployed to the Middle East, so he couldn't be there for the birth. Brian was heartbroken that he couldn't be there for this big moment. He was so excited to become a dad. Before leaving for this deployment, he'd given Jennifer a framed poem he had written about becoming a parent. And whenever they spoke on the phone, Brian couldn't wait to hear about Jennifer's latest ultrasound and how big the baby was getting. And through it all, Brian had just one request about the baby boy who would be born while he was overseas. He wanted Jennifer to name this child after him. Brian knew that there was a chance he could be killed in action, and so he wanted to guarantee that this baby always had a connection to their father. Just then, a huge, painful contraction brought Jennifer back into the present, and her doctor told her, "Come on, one more push, just one more push." And a few minutes later, Jennifer was holding a screaming little baby boy, Brian Jr., in her arms. 9 months later, on Christmas morning, Jennifer sat on the couch, helping baby Brian open his presents, while Brian Sr. sat next to them, sipping coffee. Jennifer looked over at him and squeezed his leg. Ever since coming home a few months ago, Brian had been this amazing father and partner. He did what he could to help with the baby, and he was extremely attentive to Jennifer's needs. He loved to hold her hand and talk about their future together. But Jennifer felt like she was still getting to know Brian. They hadn't been dating that long before she got pregnant and he went off to war. So when he sometimes got moody and walked out in a huff, Jennifer didn't really know what to think. But with Brian's charming smile and good looks, Jennifer could never stay mad at him for very long. And after all, he did always come back, which was more than she could say for her previous boyfriends. The father of her first child was hardly in her young daughter's life at all. But on this particular morning, their first Christmas together as a family, Brian began acting pretty strangely.
When Jennifer handed him a present for the baby and asked Brian Sr. to help open it, Brian Sr. refused. And then a dark expression came over his face and he got up off the couch and began pacing. Jennifer had no idea what he was doing, and at first she thought, maybe he's having a flashback from his time in the Middle East. And so she asked Brian, hey, are you okay? But Brian just kept on pacing. And then at some point, Brian came to a stop, he took a deep breath and looked Jennifer in the eye and said, "I don't think I'm Brian Jr.'s father." Jennifer was totally stunned. She asked Brian where this was coming from. Then she held the baby up and asked how could he believe this child was anyone else's but his. The baby looked just like Brian Sr. But Brian Sr. refused to listen, and he ultimately stormed out of the room, shouting that he knew the truth and was not going to raise another man's child. Jennifer didn't know what to do. She wanted to follow after him to their bedroom and get him to calm down, but Brian seemed so angry, she didn't know how he'd react if she just kept on insisting the baby really was his. So she just hung back and tried her best to comfort Brian Jr., while Brian Sr. packed a bag and left the house. About 2 months later, Jennifer was at home, balancing her son on her hip while she tried to cook some lunch for him and his sister. Adjusting to life as a single mother had been very challenging for Jennifer, and she wasn't getting much help from anybody else in her family either. Jennifer's sister was around a lot, but she was also a drug addict. And so a lot of the times when Jennifer's sister came over, she'd come over with a friend or two and they were high on heroin. Sometimes Jennifer even caught her sister and her friends injecting drugs in her house. Jennifer hated all the substance abuse around her kids, but at the same time, she just didn't have the heart to stop her sister from coming around because it meant a lot to her sister to visit the kids. Every now and again, Jennifer would try calling Brian for help, but whenever he actually answered the phone, he would just yell at her about how Brian Jr. was not his son. Jennifer did her best not to let it bother her and just focused on trying to raise her kids as best as she could. But as Jennifer cooked up some mac and cheese, she noticed little Brian's breathing suddenly sounded different. He was wheezing and it seemed like he was having a hard time catching his breath. Jennifer had no idea what was going on, but just from the looks of it, this didn't look like a common cold or something else that was easy to explain. This looked pretty serious. And so as her little boy continued to struggle to breathe, Jennifer just picked up her phone, called her mom, and told her to meet her at the hospital. Then Jennifer bundled up her kids and drove to the nearest emergency room. A few hours later, Jennifer was sitting beside little Brian's crib at St. Joseph's West Hospital in Lake St. Louis. The baby was hooked up to an IV, as well as all sorts of monitors that measured his vitals. Thankfully, though, he was now breathing normally. Little Brian's pediatrician, Dr. Linda Steele Green, was treating the baby for pneumonia and asthma, a chronic disease that can make breathing difficult. The doctor explained that Brian Jr. had an asthma attack, but she had given him some treatments to stabilize him. For Jennifer, this diagnosis was both relieving and kind of daunting. She now knew baby Brian would be okay, but asthma was a condition that her son would have to live with for the rest of his life. Jennifer thought about the baby's father, Brian Sr. Even though he had not been involved in his son's life since he moved out, Jennifer figured she should let him know what was going on. So she used the hospital room's phone to call another hospital where Brian Sr. worked as a lab tech. A few moments later, one of Brian's colleagues answered the call, and Jennifer told them to please find Brian Stewart because his son was at St. Joseph's Hospital. But the person on the other end sounded confused. They asked Jennifer if she was maybe looking for a different Brian Stewart, because the Brian Stewart that worked there had never said anything about having a son. Jennifer almost slammed the phone down in anger. She knew Brian was in denial about being little Brian's father, but this was just disgraceful. Trying to stay calm, she assured the colleague that, oh yes, she had the right Brian Stewart and to please relay this message as soon as possible. After Jennifer hung up, she did her best to put Brian Sr. out of her mind. For now, the only thing that mattered was her baby boy getting better. The next morning, Jennifer was leaning over the edge of little Brian's hospital crib as he slept, holding his hand. The breathing treatments were working, and once the baby woke up, the doctor said he was well enough to go home. Jennifer got up to go pack some things when she suddenly heard someone walk through the door. She turned around, and much to her surprise, Brian Sr. was standing there with his white lab coat folded over his arm. He said he was there to see the baby. Jennifer was definitely surprised to see him. She didn't really know how she felt about it, But at the same time, she was grateful that her ex-boyfriend obviously cared enough about their son that he was here now to visit him in the hospital. Brian Sr. placed his lab coat down on a chair and then walked over to Jennifer and gently took Brian Jr. from her arms. Brian Sr. smiled at the baby and then said to Jennifer that she should take a break and grab a snack. Jennifer smiled and took him up on the offer and headed down to the hospital cafeteria. About 20 minutes later, Jennifer was done with her break, so she stepped back into the elevator and rode it upstairs towards the pediatric floor. When the elevator doors opened, Jennifer heard the unmistakable sound of her own child screaming, and so Jennifer took off running towards her son's room. Once she got there, she found Brian Sr. sitting in a rocking chair, looking terrified and very confused. He was holding little Brian in his arms. The baby was sobbing. Jennifer tried to run over and grab her son, but before she could, nurses rushed in and put little Brian back in his bed and began taking his vitals. They said his blood pressure and pulse were much higher than normal. A moment later, little Brian's pediatrician, Dr. Steele Green, came in to examine him. Jennifer stood off to the side, biting her nails nervously. Finally, after doing the exam, Dr. Steele Green told Jennifer that she couldn't explain why little Brian's vital signs were so off. He was stable now, but whatever had just happened definitely was not an asthma attack. So a decision was made to keep Brian Jr. in the hospital for further observation instead of discharging him like they'd planned. Jennifer turned to Brian Sr. and asked him what happened while she was gone. He just shrugged. He said everything was going fine, Brian Jr. seemed perfectly happy, and then all of a sudden, he was just crying his lungs out. Jennifer asked Brian Sr. if he wanted to stay a bit longer, but he just shook his head and said no. He said he had a lot to do and that he wouldn't be much help here anyway. Then he picked up his lab coat, and after waving goodbye to the baby, he left Jennifer alone to comfort their son. Jennifer stayed in the room with Brian Jr. for the next few days as doctors continued to monitor his progress. Finally, Dr. Steele Green said it was safe for them to go home now. As Jennifer strapped her son into a stroller, the pediatrician told her to look out for asthma symptoms. But beyond that, her baby boy should be just fine. 4 years later, in the spring of 1996, Jennifer ran a bath for Brian Jr., who was now 5 years old. After the frightening hospital visit when he was an infant, Brian's childhood had actually gone as normally as it could. But he hadn't actually seen his father again since that hospital visit. Brian Sr. continued to deny that he was the child's father, and he very clearly did not want to be involved in this baby's life anyway. Jennifer thought ultimately it was for the best. It was Brian Sr.'s loss. Jennifer and Brian Jr. were getting along just fine by themselves. Once the bath was ready, Jennifer squirted some soap on a washcloth and began to get Brian cleaned up. But as she scrubbed him, she noticed something strange. They'd gone to the park earlier, and Brian had gotten a couple of scrapes and cuts like all kids do, but they looked really red and swollen. And some fresh mosquito bites that he had gotten at the park looked huge and inflamed. It was like his body was not properly healing itself. Jennifer helped her son out of the bath and put some bandages on his wounds, and as they walked to his room to get ready for bed, Jennifer noticed Brian Jr. was now walking strangely, like he was having trouble keeping his balance. Jennifer held her son's hands to try to help him walk, and she noticed his palms felt clammy. So Jennifer took his temperature, and she was shocked to see the thermometer read 105 degrees. Even though Brian Jr. had just been in the bath, Jennifer knew Brian's body temperature should not be this high. This was a potentially lethal fever, and he needed medical attention right away. Once they arrived at the hospital, little Brian was taken straight to the pediatric intensive care unit. Jennifer did her best not to panic, as a team of doctors, including Dr. Steele Green, hooked up Brian Jr. to a bunch of monitors and stuck needles in his arms for IVs and blood tests. It was nerve-wracking, but Jennifer was glad that Dr. Steele Green was there. The two women had become friends after Brian Jr.'s hospital stay when he was a baby, and Dr. Steele Green had continued to see the boy for regular pediatric appointments. Jennifer was very confident that Dr. Steele Green would be able to help her son. By the end of the day, little Brian had been stabilized, but the doctors still didn't know what was wrong with him. Dr. Steele Green promised Jennifer she would run every test she could, and hopefully they would have an answer in the morning. That night, Jennifer lay awake on the couch inside of little Brian's hospital room, listening to her son's heart monitor beeping. Jennifer had been trying to stay optimistic, but it was now clear that little Brian was seriously ill. But still, Jennifer knew that Dr. Steele Green would do everything she could to figure out what was wrong. Just as Jennifer was beginning to fall asleep, little Brian suddenly shot up in bed, crying and screaming for his mother. Jennifer rushed over to him and tried to calm him down, but he just kept on sobbing and begging his mother not to let him die. Jennifer promised her son that he'd be okay. The doctors would figure out what was wrong with him, and they would fix it. She said this over and over again and held her son close until finally little Brian did drift back to sleep. A few days later, Jennifer sat beside little Brian's hospital bed, gripping his hand as he slept. Ever since he'd been admitted, Jennifer had barely left her son's side. Little Brian was in extremely bad shape, and Jennifer didn't want to be away from him in case something really bad happened. Over the past few days, little Brian had grown weaker and weaker as his organs began to shut down one by one. His skin had grown jaundiced and yellow because his liver and spleen were not working properly, his ears were infected, and his digestive system had almost entirely shut down. And the doctors really had no idea why any of this was happening. They had tested little Brian for everything they could think of, even diseases that had been largely eradicated or only existed in other countries. Everything had come back negative. As Jennifer went down her mental checklist of all little Brian's symptoms, trying to come up with some explanation that kind of made sense, she heard a knock at the door. Dr. Steele Green opened it up and stood in the doorway with a very somber look on her face. She walked in and took a seat in a chair next to Jennifer. Jennifer could see tears forming in the doctor's eyes, and a pit began to form in Jennifer's stomach. She knew that whatever news Dr. Steele Green had, it would not be good. In a quiet voice, Dr. Steele Green told Jennifer they had finally figured out what was wrong with little Brian. It was something so unlikely, she would have probably never figured it out on her own. The only reason she'd even thought to test for it was because the possibility came to her in a nightmare. As she slept, a series of frightening images came into her mind. She saw blood, then she saw needles and test tubes, then she heard the squeak of a rocking chair and the sound of a baby crying. Then she was wide awake, sitting upright in her bed, finally having an idea of what might be wrong with little Brian. Normally, she wouldn't follow her dreams for medical advice, but Dr. Steele Green had been out of ideas, and she was willing to try anything at this point. So they had gone ahead and tested Brian for this really specific, terrible disease, and it would turn out the doctor's nightmare diagnosis was correct. Brian tested positive. Now there was no more sugarcoating. Little Brian didn't have long to live. Because he'd just tested positive for the HIV virus, and it had turned into full-blown AIDS at a time when there was basically no treatments for the disease. HIV can prevent the body from fighting off even the slightest infection. The disease that the virus causes is called AIDS, and 30 years ago, it was an absolute death sentence. Dr. Steele Green estimated Brian had maybe 5 months left to live. Jennifer was absolutely speechless. Panic raced through her mind as she wondered how this could have happened. Jennifer didn't know much about HIV, but from what she did know, you got it from having sex with someone who had HIV, or you got it from sharing contaminated needles. But of course, Brian was doing neither of those things because he was 5 years old. But then Jennifer's mind went to a dark place. Her thoughts turned to her sister, who was a heroin addict, who still sometimes used drugs in their house. Jennifer had done her best to keep Brian away from her sister when she was doing that, but she wondered if somehow maybe he'd gotten poked with an HIV-infected needle when she wasn't paying attention. Or, much, much worse, maybe a stranger who was infected with HIV had done the unspeakable and sexually abused her son. Jennifer looked over at her son and just began to cry. Her children were absolutely everything to her. And so for now, Jennifer knew she had to focus on just finding a way to keep her son alive. So she turned to Dr. Steele Green and told her that she was willing to do whatever it took to help Brian. 2 years later, Jennifer stood in her kitchen helping her son, Brian Jr., wiggle into a special backpack. Brian was miraculously still alive, but just barely. This special backpack he was wearing was connected to a feeding tube that led into little Brian's stomach. He needed a liquid diet to survive because he basically always vomited if he ate solid food. But both Jennifer and Brian agreed that it was a worthy trade-off because he'd beaten all expectations and lived long past the 5 months his doctors had estimated. But it wasn't easy to get by. because Brian required so much help every single day, Jennifer had been forced to quit her job. And because her ex-boyfriend, Brian Sr., still wouldn't send child support payments, Jennifer and her kids had to live off of food stamps and other welfare programs. And just from a medical perspective, it took a lot of work for Brian just to make it through each day. After getting his backpack secured, Jennifer walked over to the cabinet and pulled out a massive medication tray. She carefully doled out 23 different pills for Brian to take. Once Brian had taken all of his medications, Jennifer took him by the hand and they went outside to wait for the school bus. Because there was still so much fear around AIDS, little Brian was not allowed to ride on the standard school bus with most of the other kids. Instead, he had to ride on another bus for children with special needs. Jennifer's heart broke just thinking about the bullying Brian had to endure at school. Bullies called him all sorts of names, and they mocked him for the bulky hearing aids he now had to wear all the time after losing 80% of his hearing. But through it all, Brian remained relentlessly optimistic. Jennifer was so proud of his ability to remain positive despite all the suffering he'd endured, and so Jennifer did her best to not let her own fears and her own anxieties get in the way of her son's childhood. Now, just keeping her son alive basically consumed all of Jennifer's waking hours. But she also had one other major concern about her son, figuring out how he'd actually been infected with the HIV virus in the first place. A few minutes later, the bus pulled up in front of their house. Jennifer hugged her son goodbye, and then he climbed on board the bus and the bus took off, and then Jennifer went back inside her home. After she got dressed, she called Detective Kevin Wilson down at the St. Charles County Sheriff's Office. For the past 2 years, Detective Wilson had worked tirelessly to try to figure out how Brian had gotten HIV. The detective had tested the blood of at least 30 people who had spent time with Brian Jr., including Jennifer's sister and her friends, but none of them had been HIV positive, so this very likely ruled out transmission from drugs. The detective had also found no indication that little Brian had ever been sexually abused by anyone, so it was highly unlikely he got HIV that way either. But there was one lead that Detective Wilson was still working on, and that was what Jennifer was calling him about today. Detective Wilson assured her that he was close to cracking the case, but there were still some loose ends to tie up. This was a delicate situation, and he had to be absolutely sure he was right before he made his move. Before they hung up, Detective Wilson promised Jennifer that little Brian would get the justice he deserved. A few months later, in December of 1998, Jennifer sat down in the witness stand at the front of a St. Louis County courtroom. Her hands shook as she looked to her right at the judge. Right out in front of her, she saw there were news reporters, jury members, and at the defendant's table, her ex-boyfriend, Brian Stewart. He stared at her with cold, hateful eyes. Jennifer swore to tell the truth, and then took a deep breath. Speaking into a small microphone, she explained that she broke up with Brian Sr. in 1991. She said they fought bitterly over child support payments, and at one point, Brian even threatened her. Brian insisted that Brian Jr. was not his son, and Jennifer should stop asking him to give her money, because, after all, Brian Jr. wouldn't even live past the age of 5. Jennifer testified that way back when little Brian was first treated for asthma, his father showed up at the hospital totally unannounced and convinced her to leave the room to go on a break. And when she came back from that break, their son was screaming. Brian Sr. had left quickly, and that was the last time he ever saw his son. Little Brian seemed okay for the next 4 years, until he suddenly developed confusing and terrifying medical problems. Jennifer's voice broke as she recounted all the painful memories. The prosecuting attorney thanked her, and she stepped down from the witness stand. Then the attorney turned to the jury and explained that the answer to this mystery could be found in one place: Brian Sr.'s job. Brian Sr. worked as a hospital lab technician who was responsible for drawing blood from patients. He had access to tons of blood samples, including blood from people who are sick with infectious diseases. Brian Sr.'s work was the missing puzzle piece. With it, the prosecution could explain exactly what happened to little Brian. It went like this. Brian Stewart was an abusive boyfriend who never wanted to be a father, even though he pretended to be very enthusiastic at first. Once he moved out, he was angry over child support payments, so he hatched a plan to make them go away. On the day that 11-month-old little Brian Jr. was supposed to leave the hospital, Brian Sr. showed up carrying his lab coat. Inside his coat pocket was a vial of blood he'd stolen from the phlebotomy lab where he worked. He told Jennifer to go take a break and he would watch the baby, and then while she was gone, he used a tiny butterfly needle to inject his infant son with that contaminated blood, hoping it would eventually kill the baby. That blood came from a patient who was obviously HIV positive. So for the next 4 years, little Brian lived with the HIV virus in his body until it transformed into full-blown AIDS. And by the time the doctors figured out what was happening, the disease had already progressed, seemingly beyond hope. Ultimately, Brian Sr. would be sentenced to life in prison. The story of what he'd done to his own baby son made international news. People were absolutely horrified, but they were also inspired by Brian Jr.'s resilience. In the years following the trial, Brian Jr. continued beating the odds. He made it through elementary and middle school. At 13, he began to find comfort in Christianity, which he said allowed him to forgive his father. Incredibly, Brian Jr. is still alive today. His diagnosis seemed like a death sentence in 1996, but with new scientific advancements, today, AIDS is actually a fairly treatable disease. Brian Jr. now works as a motivational speaker, and he runs a nonprofit called Hope is Vital that aims to reduce discrimination against those living with HIV and AIDS.
The shadow of the night, lost my voice, lost the fight. Hearts collide, screams ignite. Fading stars are losing light.
Whispers echo through the halls. Ghosts of laughter, ghostly calls. Silent tears behind these walls. Broken dreams crumble and
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, MrBallen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And